Thank you all for watching and supporting my videos. Your encouragement keeps me inspired to create even more content. My next big goal is to reach 1,000 subscribers, and I can't do it without your help. If you enjoy what I create, hit that subscribe button and join me on this journey. Now let's dive into the stories. When Joel started working the night shift at the supermarket, he never expected it to become something more than just another routine. Most people thought the night was a quiet time when everyone was asleep, and you could get your work done without interruptions. But anyone who worked nights knew better. The stillness of the hours after midnight held a certain tension, something unspoken, a feeling that something wasn't quite right. Joel had been working the graveyard shift for about a month now. At first it was just a job, quiet, easy. He'd stock the shelves, make sure the aisles were clean, and monitor the security cameras. No customers, no fuss. The store was mostly empty, save for the occasional delivery truck or an occasional late-night shopper. One night, around 3 a.m., he noticed something strange. As usual, the store was eerily silent. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerators and the occasional creak of the building settling. But there was something else. A shadow moved at the edge of his vision. Joel quickly turned, but there was nothing there. He shrugged it off. It was probably just his tired eyes playing tricks on him. But it happened again the next night. This time, Joel was stocking the cereal aisle when he saw the shadow again, this time closer. He could swear he saw a figure dressed in dark clothes, standing just beyond the aisle, staring at him. The store was locked up tight. No one should have been there. His heart started to race. He walked down the aisle looking for any sign of movement, but nothing. His mind started racing. Was he losing it? Was it the isolation of the night shift, the silence getting to him? Or was there something else in the store, something he couldn't see? He began to doubt his own senses. But the feeling of being watched lingered. The next few nights, the strange occurrences continued. Items moved on their own. Sometimes the lights flickered, and he could hear whispers echoing through the aisles. Joel tried to tell himself it was just the building's old wiring or perhaps a prank by someone else working the night shift. But deep down he knew it was something else. One night, Joel decided to confront whatever it was. He stood in the middle of the store waiting. The silence stretched on for what seemed like hours until finally he heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, but close. He spun around, but no one was there. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end. It was then he realized that he wasn't alone. The footsteps grew louder, echoing down the long aisles. But still there was no one. Joel's heart raced as the sound of the footsteps got closer, now right behind him. He could feel a chill on the back of his neck. His instincts screamed at him to run, but he stayed frozen, listening, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. Suddenly, the store's overhead lights flickered once more, and then everything went pitch black. The darkness was suffocating. Joel's breath came in sharp gasps as his eyes struggled to adjust, but all he could see was the deep, impenetrable black. The hum of the refrigerators had stopped, and the usual background noises were gone. Everything felt still. Too still. He fumbled for his phone, the only source of light he had. His fingers trembled as he swiped the screen, hoping the flashlight would pierce through the shadows. As soon as the beam of light flickered on, he scanned the aisles, his heart pounding in his chest. Nothing. But then he heard it again, the footsteps, this time much closer. They were almost directly behind him, slow and methodical. His blood ran cold. Joel turned quickly, shining his flashlight at the sound, but again there was nothing. Just empty aisles, the shelves towering in silence. The flashlight's beam flickered, and for a split second, Joel thought he saw something, a figure, tall and cloaked in dark clothing, standing at the end of the aisle facing him. His breath hitched and his pulse raced. He called out, his voice shaky, "Hello? Who's there?" No answer. The footsteps stopped and the air grew heavier. Joel's instincts screamed at him to leave, to get out of the store. But there was no way out without passing through the aisles, and something about that shadow made him hesitate. It was almost as if the figure was waiting for him, watching his every move. He took a tentative step forward, his shoes squeaking on the linoleum floor. The lights buzzed back to life, one by one, flickering like dying stars. But when they finally stabilized, Joel was met with something far worse than darkness. The figure was gone, vanished as if it had never been there. He felt a brief moment of relief, but it was quickly replaced by a rising sense of dread. That's when the voices started. At first they were faint whispers, indistinct and too quiet to make out. But as Joel stood frozen, they grew louder, clearer. They came from all around him, echoing off the walls. His heart raced. The voices didn't belong to anyone he knew, and they sounded distorted. He could hear snippets of words, some pleading, some angry, but they didn't make sense. Get out. Leave. It's too late. Joel's mind raced, his thoughts scattered. Was this some kind of sick joke? Was someone playing with him, messing with his mind? But there was no way someone could have gotten in. The store had been locked and no one else had access to the back rooms. Joel. Joel. The voice whispered his name, sending a chill down his spine. He whipped around, shining the flashlight in every direction, but there was no one. Panic began to set in. He couldn't stay here. He had to leave. He turned toward the exit, but as he moved toward the front doors, the feeling of being watched returned. The air grew colder and the footsteps started again, this time coming from every direction. Suddenly the overhead speakers crackled to life. The voice that came through wasn't human, gravelly and mechanical, like it had been distorted by time and age. Joel. Stay with us. His blood ran cold. The doors were locked. The windows were sealed. He couldn't escape. Joel's heart raced. He slammed his palms against the glass doors, but they didn't budge. Locked. Panic surged through him, his breath shallow and quick. The cold air seemed to close in, the whispers growing louder. Stay with us. The words echoed again, this time with a twisted urgency. He staggered backward, trying to focus, trying to make sense of it all. He reached for his phone, hands shaking, and dialed 911, but the call didn't go through. The screen flashed briefly before turning to static. The lights above flickered again, and as they did, the store seemed to warp, like the walls were stretching, twisting. Joel blinked, trying to clear his vision. In the dim light he could see something moving just out of the corner of his eye. He turned sharply toward it. There, at the end of the aisle, a shape was slowly materializing. A tall, shadowy figure, draped in what appeared to be a tattered coat, standing unnaturally still. It felt wrong, unnatural. Joel's mind screamed for him to run, but his legs felt like lead, his body frozen in place. The figure tilted its head, slowly, deliberately, its face still hidden in shadow. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the sharp sound of a door slamming in the back of the store. Joel snapped his head in the direction of the sound. A figure stood in the back hallway, illuminated only by the faint glow of the emergency lights. This one was smaller, hunched, and moving quickly toward him. Joel backed away, heart pounding. The footsteps from all sides had merged into a single chaotic rhythm, growing louder, faster, until the air itself felt suffocating. He turned toward the aisles, his mind desperate for escape, but the entire store seemed to have changed. The shelves were no longer lined with neatly stocked goods. Instead, there were twisted, contorted shapes, their labels unreadable. The floor had begun to crack and splinter as though the very foundation of the building was crumbling beneath his feet. The air was heavy with a strange odor now, a mixture of rot and mildew. Joel's head throbbed, his vision swimming. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and for a fleeting moment, he hoped it was a call from the outside world, something real. But when he pulled it out, it wasn't a call. It was a message. Joel, stop looking. You won't find what you're seeking. The store is ours now. His blood ran cold. He looked up, and the figure in the back hallway had disappeared. But now there was another shape. A different figure, taller than the others, slowly emerging from the aisles, its footsteps echoing through the store. Joel, it whispered. You're too late. Joel's legs finally gave way. He collapsed to the ground, unable to move. The figure was approaching, its form becoming clearer with each passing moment. And then just as it reached him, it stopped. The figure's head tilted slightly as if examining him, and Joel could feel the weight of its gaze, even without seeing its eyes. Join us, the figure breathed. The air grew cold once more, and Joel shivered as the figure reached out to him, its hand thin and unnaturally long, almost skeletal. He could feel the chill from its touch even before it made contact. His hand trembled, and he instinctively tried to push it away, but there was no strength left in him. The figure's cold fingers brushed his skin and everything went black. Night Shift. Part 4. Joel woke with a start. For a moment he thought he had just imagined it all. He was lying on the cold tile floor, alone. The store was silent again, the lights were flickering overhead, and the aisles were once again stocked with goods. But something was different. The air felt heavy and his body was sore, like he had been unconscious for hours. He pushed himself up, rubbing his eyes. His phone lay nearby, still lit up with the message from earlier. He didn't know how much time had passed, but something in his gut told him the worst was far from over. He glanced at the clock on the wall. 3:45 a.m. As he stood, the same low, eerie whisper echoed through the store. "Welcome back, Joel." Joel's pulse thudded in his ears. His breath came in sharp, ragged gasps as he stumbled to his feet. He felt the weight of the store pressing down on him, its silence, its coldness, the unseen eyes watching. The message on his phone flickered again, the words now distorted as if they were being typed by someone else. "You belong here." He felt the chilling hand that had touched him earlier and his skin crawled. Every part of him screamed to leave, but the store had become a labyrinth of twisted aisles and shadows that seemed to stretch forever. The exits were no longer where they should have been, and every time he turned a corner, the walls seemed to close in tighter. The voices started again, low and insistent, coming from all directions as if the store itself was alive. "Stay with us. Forever." Joel's mind reeled. He couldn't think straight. He wasn't sure if what he was seeing was real or if it was all a hallucination brought on by exhaustion, but the fear gnawing at him was undeniable. The figure, the one with the cold touch, was nowhere to be seen, but the presence of something malevolent lingered. He knew he had to get out. If there was one thing he had learned that night, it was that there was no leaving unless the store allowed it. And the store was not willing to let him go. Suddenly the lights buzzed, flickered one last time and went completely dark. For a moment there was absolute silence. Then he heard it, the faint sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, from behind him. He spun around, heart in his throat, but the darkness was impenetrable. A voice clearer than before whispered directly in his ear, "You never left, Joel. You've always been here." The walls seemed to close in on him. He couldn't breathe, couldn't move. Panic surged as he pressed his hand to the cold wall, but it felt different now, unnaturally smooth, cold and slick. Something was changing, warping, as if the store itself was taking shape, shifting around him. The footsteps grew louder, closer. And then the voice, no longer a whisper but a low growl, echoed through the empty aisles, "It's time for you to stay." With one final desperate effort, Joel broke free from the paralysis of fear. He ran, stumbling through the aisles, his body screaming in protest. He had to escape. But every time he reached what should have been an exit, it was replaced with another aisle, another dead end. The lights flickered again, then went out. The world around him spun and his legs gave way once more. When Joel finally opened his eyes, he found himself standing at the entrance of the store. The morning sun was rising outside, casting a pale light through the windows. The store was quiet, normal, empty as it should be. But something felt wrong. The clock on the wall showed 3:45 a.m. again. And as he glanced at the aisles, the shadows seemed deeper. The silence was too thick. And as he turned toward the front door, Joel saw the reflection of a figure standing in the corner of the store, watching him. It was the same dark figure. Its face still hidden in shadow, but its eyes gleaming with that same cold, empty stare. Joel blinked. And then the figure was gone. But the whispers, the footsteps, they hadn't stopped. And now neither had he. It was well past midnight when Amy checked the clock again. The office was quiet, unnaturally so. The only sound was the rhythmic clicking of her keyboard as she typed out yet another report. Her company, a small but steady consulting firm, had been growing, but that meant longer hours and, on rare occasions, late-night shifts for some of the employees. Amy had been working the night shift for the past few weeks, covering for a colleague who had fallen ill. It wasn't ideal, but the extra hours were a welcome relief to her savings account. The office was dark, lit only by the soft glow of her computer screen and the flickering overhead lights, which never seemed to work right. The building was old, and the creaks and groans it made at night were starting to wear on her nerves. Sitting in her cubicle, Amy glanced up from her screen, letting her eyes rest for a moment. The office seemed larger at night, the empty desks casting long shadows. The hallway was deserted, and the windows revealed nothing but the dark, empty street outside. It was almost peaceful. Almost. She was about to return to her work when she heard it. A soft thud. Like someone had dropped something. Amy froze, her eyes scanning the empty hallway outside. There was no one there, but the sound had been clear, distinct. She shrugged it off, probably something from the floor above, maybe a janitor finishing up their shift. It wasn't unusual. A few minutes later, another thud. Closer this time. Amy's heart skipped a beat. She knew the building was old, but this wasn't normal. Her office was the last one on the hall, far from the stairwell and elevators. She didn't want to be the one to investigate, but her curiosity, something she couldn't ignore, got the better of her. Taking a deep breath, she grabbed her jacket and stood, walking toward the hallway. The silence in the air felt thick, suffocating, and with each step she took, the building seemed to grow more oppressive. She reached the end of the hallway and turned the corner, her footsteps echoing off the walls. At first she saw nothing, just the dimly lit corridor stretching out before her. But then she noticed the door to the supply closet, slightly ajar. The thud had come from there. Amy hesitated, then approached the door slowly. Her hand reached for the handle, but before she could open it, the door swung wide, almost as if it had been waiting for her to come closer. The air that hit her was cold, colder than it should have been for an office building at night. Inside, the lights flickered, casting harsh shadows across the room. Boxes were stacked haphazardly against the walls, and the faint smell of dust and mildew filled the air. But there was something else, something that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Amy stepped inside, squinting into the dim light. Her eyes moved over the shelves of cleaning supplies and office equipment, then paused at the far corner. There, in the shadows, was a figure. Someone or something was standing there. Amy froze. It wasn't a person. The figure was too still, too wrong. Its shape was distorted, vague, and as she stepped closer, the temperature in the room dropped even more. She could feel the air growing heavier, the weight of the silence pressing down on her. Her breath caught in her throat. Suddenly, the figure moved, shifting unnaturally fast toward her, and Amy stumbled backward, heart racing. She turned to run but froze when she heard it, a low, guttural voice from the darkness. "You shouldn't have come here." Amy's heart hammered in her chest as she spun around, searching for an escape, but the hallway seemed farther away than it had moments ago. The office had changed. The walls felt like they were closing in, and the darkness in the hallway stretched deeper, as though the building itself had come alive. Her pulse quickened, and the sense of dread was overwhelming. She had to leave, but the path she'd walked just minutes ago was now a maze of shadows, twisting in ways that didn't make sense. She was trapped. Amy's breath was shallow as she backed away from the supply closet. Her eyes darted frantically across the hallway, which now felt like it stretched on endlessly. The familiar walls seemed to warp, the fluorescent lights above flickering in a way that made everything look distorted, like a twisted reflection in a broken mirror. She had to get back to her desk. To safety. But as she turned to flee down the hall, the sound of the door slamming shut behind her made her jump. Her heart pounded in her ears and panic surged through her body. She spun around, expecting the worst. The hallway was empty. Just silence. But the silence wasn't reassuring, it felt heavy, like the air was filled with the weight of something watching her. She knew she had to leave. She couldn't stay here. Yet when she took a step forward, her foot landed on something soft. Amy looked down and her stomach twisted. A small patch of red, a stain on the floor. She knelt down cautiously, not sure if she wanted to know what it was. It was fresh, glistening under the harsh overhead lights. A trail of it seemed to lead down the hallway, disappearing around the corner. Her instinct screamed at her to turn back, but she couldn't. Her curiosity, mixed with fear, drove her forward. She followed the trail, her footsteps barely audible in the thick silence. The trail led her to the break room. The door was slightly ajar, the light inside flickering weakly. Amy pushed it open slowly, the hinges creaking in protest. Inside, the vending machine sat untouched, the microwave sitting idle. But the room felt wrong. It was darker than it should have been, and the air smelled musty, like something had been locked away for too long. And then she saw it. A chair had been overturned, and the floor beneath it was soaked in that same red stain. But what caught her attention the most was the shadow. A figure was sitting at the small round table in the corner, facing away from her, motionless. "Amy." The voice was low, barely above a whisper, but it froze her in place. The hairs on her arms stood up as she recognized the voice, her co-worker, Kevin. He had left for the night hours ago. But now, here he was, sitting in the dark, his head slightly tilted as though he were waiting for her. "Kevin." Amy's voice cracked as she spoke, her feet unwilling to move closer. The figure didn't respond immediately. For a moment, the room was filled only with the soft hum of the fridge in the corner. Then Kevin's head slowly turned toward her, his face obscured by shadows. His eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, wide and unblinking. "You shouldn't have come here," he repeated, his voice now cold and distorted as though someone else were speaking through him. Amy's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to run, to escape, but her legs refused to move. The chill in the room deepened, and the walls seemed to shrink, the door closing of its own accord, trapping her inside. Then a sudden noise. The faint, eerie sound of scratching coming from the ceiling. Amy's eyes snapped upward, and her stomach churned at what she saw. A dark, thin shape was skittering along the ceiling, moving in unnatural, jerky motions. It had no clear form, just a shifting mass of shadows that crawled along the tiles, its movements almost too fast to follow. The figure at the table, Kevin, no, it wasn't Kevin anymore, let out a low, guttural laugh, his voice growing deeper with each breath. "It's too late, Amy," it whispered, its tone dripping with malice. "Once you hear the scratching, you can never leave." Amy's pulse pounded in her ears, and a feeling of cold dread washed over her. The scratching on the ceiling grew louder, closer, as if whatever it was coming for her. Panic gripped her chest and she turned toward the door, but it was no use. The shadows had already surrounded her, closing in from all sides. The walls seemed to melt and twist, the room warping into something that didn't belong in the real world. Her vision blurred as her heart raced, and everything felt distorted, unreal. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. The figure at the table spoke again, but this time it was no longer Kevin's voice, it was something darker, deeper, ancient. "You're ours now, Amy. You've crossed the line." The scratching stopped. And then, in the thick silence that followed, Amy heard another sound. The sound of footsteps approaching from behind her. Slow, deliberate. She turned, her breath caught in her throat, to find herself face to face with another figure, this one human, or at least it looked human. His eyes were sunken, hollow, his skin pale and almost translucent, as though he hadn't seen the light of day in years. His mouth stretched into a cruel, empty smile. "I told you," the figure rasped. "Once you hear the scratching, there's no escape." Amy's heart raced as the figure's smile widened, revealing teeth too sharp to be human. The room around her was spinning now, the walls pulsating as though the building itself was alive, breathing in time with her panicked heartbeat. She couldn't think clearly, could barely focus through the blurring of her vision. She was trapped. Completely, utterly trapped. The figure didn't move, not yet, but the oppressive silence that filled the room felt like it was suffocating her. Her mind was flooded with images of her co-workers, her life outside these walls. The outside world seemed so far away now, so unreachable. In an instant the air changed. It wasn't cold anymore, but thick, heavy with a sense of dread that clung to her skin. Amy took a shaky step back, her hands trembling. She had to get out. She had to. "Stop fighting it," the figure whispered. "It's already done." Amy's mind raced, trying to process what was happening, but nothing made sense. It felt like she was in a nightmare, but every moment of terror was too real to be a dream. She glanced toward the door, now fully aware that the figure standing in front of her wasn't just a person, it was something else. Something that had taken Kevin and maybe even more before him. The scratching started again, louder now, almost deafening. It was coming from the ceiling, the walls, the floors, everywhere. It was as though the entire building was coming alive, crawling with something unseen. The sound was overwhelming, clawing at her mind, pushing her to the brink of madness. Amy turned and ran. She didn't think. She didn't hesitate. She bolted for the exit, the sound of her own feet pounding against the floor the only thing she could focus on. But as she reached the door, it slammed shut with a violent force, trapping her inside. She slammed her fists against the glass, screaming for help, but no one was there. The office building was silent, deserted. Suddenly, a voice whispered in her ear. The same voice from before. "You can't leave, Amy. Not now. Not ever." With a surge of desperation, Amy twisted the doorknob, but it refused to budge. Her breath came in ragged gasps as the figure closed the distance between them. It was there, so close, so much closer than she realized. "Your time is up," the figure rasped, now looming over her. "The building's never been empty. It just waits for its next occupant." Amy's world blurred, the edges of her vision going dark. The shadows wrapped around her, tightening with each passing second, until she couldn't breathe. And then nothing. The next morning, when the office manager arrived, she found the building just as it always was, empty, silent, and seemingly lifeless. Amy's desk was still there, her computer left on, but there was no sign of her. The manager called her cell phone, left messages, but there was no answer. As the hours passed, the police arrived, but even they couldn't find anything. The building had no signs of forced entry, no reason for anyone to be missing. Amy had simply disappeared. Months went by, but rumors started to spread among the night shift workers. They spoke of footsteps in the hallways when no one was there, of whispers in the dark, and strange figures seen in the corners of the building. The scratching continued, faint but always there, just out of sight. No one ever worked a night shift in that building again. And the office remained empty. Silent. Waiting for its next occupant.